Good morning. I'm Rosemary Pena, president of the Black German Heritage and Research Association and adjunct professor of German studies at the University of British Columbia at Vancouver. Our conversation today is the 26th in our All Black Lives Matter series. My colleague, Dr. Emily Fraser-Rath, and I, and our students here at Davidson College are especially honored to welcome Dr. Michelle Moyd into our virtual classroom. To get the conversation started, I'll first ask Emily if she will introduce our special guest and share a little about our class here at Davidson before turning the program over to our students and Dr. Moyd. Emily?
Thank you, Rosemary. My name is Emily Fraser-Rath, and I am a visiting assistant professor of German studies at Davidson College, located just north of Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm also the executive director of the BGHRA. We are so excited to be able to invite Dr. Michelle Moyd to our class, to Davidson College, and to the BGHRA today. Today is February 15th, 2022, and we, Dr. Pena, me, and most importantly, our incredible Davidson students are in our 4th official week together. This semester, Dr. Pena and I are so pleased to have another opportunity to work with Davidson students as we co-teach our 2nd course together. German 351, or Race, Gender, Migration, asks us to employ a critical lens informed by Black German studies to questions of migration, belonging, and identity, as these big human topics intersect with Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, with the German-speaking world, and with the lives and experiences of the global Black German community. The class, like its predecessor, consists of 3 parts. It is first an exploration of the aforementioned themes as they are, or could be, handled in the field of Black German studies. Second, it is a community-based learning course as we support the BGHRA through our work, and will feature our final projects, as the students did last semester, on the BGHRA archive. And third, it is most importantly an opportunity for students, and through these recordings, our broader BGHRA and Davidson communities to speak with people whose lives and work intersect with, influence, shape, and inform Black German studies. This series would not be possible without the generous support of the Dean Rusk International Studies Program Speaker Fund here at Davidson, and the interim director of the Dean Rusk program, Dr. Verna Case, as well as its program administrator, Meg Zweifel. I also cannot ever thank Meg Sawicki, our German Studies Department administrator, enough for her support, encouragement, and organization that has truly kept us going and remains a vital part of what we are doing. So to Meg, Mel, and to Verna, thank you. Before Dr. Pena and I fade into the background and turn things over to Dr. Moyd and our wonderful students, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our guest. Dr. Michelle Moyd is Ruth N. Hall's Associate Professor of History at Indiana University in Bloomington. She is the author of Violent Intermediaries, African Soldiers, Conquest, and Everyday Colonialism in German East Africa. And that was out with Ohio University Press in 2014. In preparation for today's discussion with Dr. Moyd, our students and us engaged with the preface and the first chapter of this book in particular, though I know from students' questions that they also read other parts of the book as well. She is also, Dr. Moyd is also co-author with Yulia Komska and David Gramling of Linguistic Disobedience, Restoring Power to Civic Language. And that was out with Palgrave in 2019. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Michelle Moyd and to our students. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to Dr. Pena as well for inviting me to do this, and for being great colleagues in this field, which has really made such great strides in the last, since I was in graduate school, for sure. It's a whole different world. And thanks to you all for reading my work. I watched a bit of what Professor Aitken put together for you last week. And so I know that he sort of built things in, he sort of did things in an interactive way. And I think I will also follow that model. But I thought I would start maybe by kind of engaging you with some images and a little bit of storytelling to try and orient you to the work that I do. And hopefully that will also give you some ways of thinking about the intersections between my work and Dr. Aitken's, as well as the ways that they diverge, or not diverge, but the ways that they explore different kinds of angles on the wider topic of Black Germany. So the first thing to say is that I'm a historian of Africa. So the work that I do is rooted in African history, and my focal point is on African peoples. So you know, the ways that I think about questions of Black Germanness and the relationship between Germany and Africa is very much informed by the fact that I center African peoples first. So let me share my screen and I'll go through. So we have, it's 10 o'clock and we have until 11:15, is that right?
11:05.
11:05, okay, great, thank you. All right, so I'll try to keep track of time and maybe just talk for 15-20 minutes about some of these images and engage you as well. All right, share screen. I have not done this in quite some time because I've been on leave. Okay. So can you see that? All right, let me change to slideshow. All right, so this is a series of images that I've used in lots of talks, and I find that they're typically useful in bringing out some of the key themes that I'm interested in my work, and hopefully you'll also find them interesting. So this first one on this kind of introductory screen shows a surrender scene, and would anyone like to guess when this surrender took place, when and where this surrender took place, a military surrender? Any ideas on what's represented in the image and what that might tell you about where it took place?
Would it be in 1918 after the armistice?
Yep. So yeah, that's definitely timing wise. It's actually about 2 weeks after the armistice in Europe. Any ideas on where? And this can be general. You don't have to be super specific about it. Any clues in the image about where in the world this could be?
Michelle, could we try to reshare this? It looks like it's in speaker mode and the image is a little small.
Okay.
So if you go to the top and end show.
Okay.
And then, yeah, and then we can try again here. Oh, it's still in.
So are you're just seeing the small like presentation?
If you
Okay.
go to, I think, swap displays at the top, that should do it.
Okay. How's that?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for telling me.
Okay.
Okay, so now that the picture's bigger, are there any clues in it that help you see where it might have taken place? How about those trees in the background? I mean, where would you see trees like that potentially?
So you're going to be on a coast because you have the palm tree on your left.
Okay, yep, potentially coastal or at least tropical, right? I mean, palm trees don't typically grow in European zones, for example, at least not Central or Northern European. Okay, anything else that might clue you into where this is happening? On the very far edge of the image, do you see somebody who is carrying a shield and a spear? Okay, so that is a clue to something, right? That is also not a mode of warfare that one would typically see in Europe, for example. How about those flags?
They're British and German.
Right. Okay, so the Union Jack and then the German imperial flag. Are these troops white?
It
It's a little
appears,
bit of a trick question, but
yeah, I was gonna say how it's drawn. It appears that the generals are white because they're the ones in the front with the swords, but then all the soldiers are of, it could even be a variety of color.
yeah. Well, certainly what's being represented is that the two, as you said, the two men in the center are the officers. They seem to be lighter than the other troops that are represented there. Okay, so that image, I think, is useful for kind of setting the stage in terms of understanding that that World War I was fought in different ways around the world. So this is, in fact, a surrender scene from World War I, 2 weeks after the armistice, because the information about the armistice took so long to get to soldiers who were fighting in the field in East Africa. So this image is a representation of the surrender at Abercorn in Northern Rhodesia, today Mbala, Zambia, that took place between British Empire and the German Empire, as the British claimed victory as part of the armistice, et cetera, right? So this is a World War I story, but it's a different one than most of you are probably familiar with. So this image, which, you know, if you can read the caption in the small print down there, you'll see that it takes, and actually the date at the top, which tells you that it was published in the Tanganyika Standard, 1964, a very different time, but in the same general geographic space. So in 1964, German East Africa was independent Tanganyika, which then became Tanzania once Zanzibar was united with it that same year. And what you see here are two elderly men shaking hands with a German official at the German embassy in Tanganyika. So we've skipped forward by, what is that, 40 something years to 50 something years to a moment where where Tanganyika is independent of colonial rule. And yet this connection between these elderly men and the German official still indicates that there are ties between this formerly colonized space and Germany. And if you read the caption, you'll see that these are two ex-askari, ex-soldiers of the German colonial army in their senior years, who are about to travel to Germany to honor the death of their former commander, General von Lettow-Vorbeck. Which would have, you know, thinking about what Professor Aitken talked about with you last week, as part of this idea of making more fluid or opening up ways of understanding Black people in Germany. This is another moment where we see a way that Black people are traveling to Germany. And we're not talking huge numbers, but this was an exceptional moment where these old men who had been separated from their former commander for all of these decades are going to Germany in order to pay their respects at his funeral. And the reason that they had been separated for all those years is because Germany lost the war, and Germany also lost its colonies at the end of the war. So that meant that the former Askari who were represented in that first image I showed you kind of became, they were cut off from their former patrons. And so if you read the first chapter of my book, you know how important it was that these men were tied to their German commanders for securing their position within German East Africa. After the Germans went back to Germany following their defeat in World War I and the loss of the German colonies, these men were largely left on their own. So again, this image captures a lot, I think, about what's being recognized here, which is that even though there have been all of these intervening decades, there's still this sense of connection between these African soldiers who fought for the German Empire and the now post-war West German nation state, right? And then the post-independence new nation state of Tanganyika. Any questions so far? I've been blabbing a lot, but feel free to jump in if you have questions or comments. Okay. So this is the cover of my book, and here again, I'm going to ask you to look at this picture and think with me about what you see. I selected this picture for specific reasons. And I think it conveys quite a bit about what I argue about these troops, the Askari, and why they did what they did. So looking at it, and I kind of gave it away in the preface, but just in case anybody skipped that part or this concretizes things for you. What's your initial impression of this photograph? Or what kinds of things jump out at you about it?
Carson.
Yeah, so I did read the preface, so I won't spoil it, but something that jumps out right away is the terrain they're on and how the soldiers wearing shoes and the women and children are not, and just that it looks very sandy and rocky.
Okay. Thank you. I had not thought about that. Actually, as many times as I've looked at this image, I had not thought to contrast the soldier with his family in that way. Other things, or the people around him, let's say, if they are his family. Other thoughts?
Even though you can't really distinguish their facial expressions, it just seems like a really intimate moment, between the family before the soldier leaves.
Mm-hmm. What makes you say that? I mean, what are the kinds of things that make you read it that way?
Just all the children just surrounding, and they're all holding hands.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other thoughts?
I would also say the fact that the soldier has a gun in front of the children. It's interesting that at such a young age, the children are exposed to that.
Okay. Another thing I had not thought about. Maybe one last one. Has anybody noticed what is going on in the background of the photo? Like what the setting is? So Carson mentioned the terrain. but what do you see kind of in the background?
Steffi, I know you have thoughts here.
The background looks like they're like huts, and the top of the roofs are like straw.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thatched roofs, huts, or small homes. And so this photo is cropped, and in the larger version, you can also see a space where there are cooking implements and things. So it conveys a sense of domesticity, right? This is a place where home life is happening. And that is reinforced then by the fact that he is standing with people we understand to be his family. You know, we don't know because there's no further identifying imagery, but certainly the suggestion here is that this is a man with his wife and their children. And if you know anything about portraiture in this time, you know that this is kind of a very common pose that certainly would have been familiar to German audiences because they posed the same way, which is a really interesting thing to think about, right? Because photography at this time it wasn't like it is now, where you just whip out your iPhone and snap a picture of whatever you want. Photography took quite a bit of time to set up, to process all of that. And so thinking about then how this was composed, what role the Ascari himself or his family had to play in staging this image, I think those are all really interesting questions. And so I spend quite a lot of time looking at photography in these ways, trying to think about things that might be happening beyond the surface of the image. I chose this image mainly because I think it's a really great reflection of the things that were important to men like him, and which I argue in the book, that he was somebody who was striving for respectability of a certain kind. And that is reflected in the choice of having his family depicted in this way. You know, I love the point about the shoes because him having boots as a soldier is another way that he is distinct from other populations around who would not have had the same kind of footwear. It marks him as somebody who belongs to the colonial state and to the colonial military apparatus. Obviously, the gun too is a marker of his masculinity and his belonging to the army. And yeah, I mean, the way that the intimacy is put front and center seems to also suggest some things about the importance of a certain kind of family structure within this colonized environment, right? So he, in all sorts of ways, is marked as belonging to the colonial state. And I think there are some really interesting overlaps with the images, some of the images you saw with Professor Aitken, where he shows, for example, a Cameroonian elite family, multi-generation, wearing clothing that indicates their status and marks them as people who are also participants in a kind of respectability politics, although using that phrase right now feels a little bit anachronistic. Okay, so any questions here or comments? Check time. All right. So these are just two maps that I thought would be helpful to look at quickly. I presume that most of you understand kind of the general colonial geopolitics of that made Africa look the way it did on paper in 1914. But just in case you need a reminder, this is what the map of Africa kind of looked like, again, in terms of European geopolitics and influence on the continent. If you look at where German East Africa is, and then think about who occupies the territory surrounding, that tells you a lot about what unfolded in World War I, right? So when the Entente and the Central Powers went to war against each other, in theory, Africa was supposed to remain neutral, but that quickly fell apart in August of 1914, and the British and their allies undertook to essentially make it so that in the end they would be able to add German colonial territories to their own possessions in Africa. So if you look at German East Africa, you can see that Belgium borders to the west, Belgian Congo borders to the west, British East Africa today, Kenya to the north, Portuguese East Africa, Mozambique today to the south and southeast, was neutral, but also ended up more or less on the side of the Entente. And then here too, British colony of Malawi, Nyasaland, and the Rhodesias, right? Northern and southern. So that gives you a sense of what's going on in the East Africa campaign of World War I, which is the one that I study most carefully. There was also a campaign in German Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, and in Togo, and in Cameroon. So what's interesting about the German East Africa campaign is that it lasted from 1914 until 1918. And like I said at the beginning, slightly longer than the war in Europe because of the difficulty of transmitting information. And so if you look at the map on the right then, and you see all those black arrows that are pointing into the interior of German East Africa or Tanganyika, that essentially tells you the story of what happened during the East African campaign. In the end, despite the fact that General Leto Voorbeck and the Askari were able to evade the Belgians, the British, South Africans who came, who mobilized from South Africa and also contributed to the war effort there. Even though Leto Voorbeck and his forces were able to evade these troops for a long time, in the end, he did have to surrender. And that is the initial scene that I showed you in that first image. Okay, so we're at about 20 minutes now, and I'll just stop. I'll show you this last picture for now, and we can talk about this one a bit too as a way to maybe transition into some of your questions. And I have lots more pictures, so we can do this all day, but I thought I'd like to give you all a chance to bring your interests and concerns in. So we'll look at this image, and I'll do the same thing. I'll just give you a few minutes or a few seconds to look at what you see here and give me your impressions. So we could start with some basics like what is being represented here. And you can then also think about how it's being represented. So what kinds of emotions, what affect does it bring to the fore?
So on a basic level, it's depicting a battle scene.
Mm-hmm.
And then here in the foreground, we have what appears to be a wounded white German soldier being carried to safety by 2 Askari soldiers,
Yep.
which I'm guessing is linked to the emphasizing their loyalty to the German cause.
Okay. Any other comments?
It reminds me a lot of that image of the 3 women, I believe, the white woman being in the middle, held up by the black and brown woman that appears, I believe, during this time period as sort of a metaphor for how European and Western, white Western culture is held up by Africa and well, in that case, in Native peoples in the Americas. And
okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but I mean, what's interesting here is, so if you read that caption at the bottom, it translates, well, you all read German, but it translates to Askari loyalty in German East Africa. And it was created by an artist who was trying to raise money for colonial veterans, essentially. So it was a fundraising postcard, and this guy did this art in order to support that effort. So yeah, I mean, I think Duncan's first comment brought up the question or the issue of loyalty that is being represented by this, what's in the foreground of these 2 Black troops who are supporting the injured white soldier. And beyond that, so beyond loyalty, also comradeship, right? That these are men who are kind of bonded together through the experience of battle and warfare. And, again, the setting, what you see in the background reminds the viewer that this is taking place somewhere beyond the Western Front or the Eastern Front. In Europe, this is taking place in a space that is fundamentally different and foreign to most German viewers. Again, you can see the palm trees in the background, the kind of scrubby terrain, the khaki uniforms that are, and the different kind of accessories that go with them that clearly distinguish these soldiers and this battlefield from other contexts that most Germans would have been familiar with. Okay, so I'm going to stop there with showing images, although I'm happy to go back to them whenever. And yeah, maybe we can just see what questions you have and kind of go from there.
you all have such good questions, so it's just a matter of who wants to go first. Duncan, why don't you go first with your question? It might be a good lead-in to our broader conversation.
Sure. So in your research for your book and looking more into the Askari, did you have many secondary sources to engage with? Have many other historians looked at them in depth, or did you have to do most of the research from primary sources?
Oh, let's see. So the secondary literature generally treated the Askari as kind of, well, there are 2 kinds of secondary literatures that have represented them in pretty uniform ways. So one is the military historiography that came out starting in the 20s, and then kind of trickling out, continuing through, up to the 80s even, that was super interested in the ways that these soldiers were loyal to the Germans. They had this kind of outsized reputation as excellent soldiers, especially during World War I, and the ways that they stuck with Leto Forbeck through thick and thin. So there's that kind of literature. And then there's this more specific literature that was generated in the German Democratic Republic, because the main colonial archives were actually held there in Potsdam. So Marxist scholars looking at the Ascari and labeling them as brutes, people who were beholden to the German colonial project in a way that is fundamentally about extraction and violence and abuse. And that also tended to, so I'm not saying that that is wrong, but in both cases, these historiographies kind of refuse the Ascari as people with motivations and that sort of thing, right? So I was interested in figuring out who they were, because I was not convinced that it was useful to kind of have these two caricatures as the main ways of thinking about them. And so, yeah, I had to do a lot of digging for other kinds of representations, often using the same primary sources that these other folks had used, but reading them in different ways, trying to really take seriously the bits of information that I could find about them in terms of, so for example, reading unit reports about Ascari behaviors, about the ways that they misbehaved, if you will, as soldiers do, right? Soldiers drink, soldiers womanize, soldiers have massive debt. Sometimes they don't show up when they're supposed to. Sometimes they lose their uniform parts. Like those kinds of pieces of information told me kind of a different story about them from what I gleaned from these other historiographies, which were also important because they guided me to sources that I could use, but I just read them in different ways. And so that's how I ended up rendering a different kind of portrait of the Ascari as human beings with motivations and aspirations and goals, and who behaved in horrible ways, as many soldiers do, but who did so with kind of an investment in their own upward mobility and status, securing status.
Which leads into the next question listed here. But unfortunately, I don't remember who posed this. So I'll read it. How did the social hierarchy within the Ascari troops translate into the social hierarchies within Germany regarding how African individuals were accepted in the country? So for example, were the people who were considered Ascari or who were Ascari given a higher status than the West African or the East Africans in German colonies?
Wow. So as opposed to other European armies that used African troops elsewhere, so most notably the French, who deployed thousands of African troops to Europe to fight, and they fought elsewhere in the Dardanelles and other places. The Germans never intended to do that. And they never could, because the way that the war, it kind of engulfed them, made it so that they would have not been able to deploy troops anywhere else anyway. They were blockaded from the coast, so troop mobility was not a factor. They didn't have huge armies anyway, so it wasn't like they would have been able to kind of send thousands of men elsewhere. So I guess I start there in order to indicate something about the ways that German racial thought kind of insisted on the Ascari as being important and valuable in their prescribed space. They were not supposed to show up in Germany. Now, the exceptions, there are always exceptions, were the individual men, and I'll show you one. I'll share my screen again. Individuals who made their way to Germany in order to try and make a living after World War I. Most of whom were not Ascari, but this is one case where I can point to a person and say, this person was actually an Ascari during World War I. He's been well studied by a few different scholars at this point. His story is pretty well researched. Mahjoub bin Adam Mohammed, also known as Bayoumi Mohammed Hussein, who was born in 1904 in Dar es Salaam. And he served during World War I. He was the son of an Ascari, and he served during World War I as a so-called Ascari boy. He was somebody who was kind of a combination of a servant and kind of a soldier's apprentice. He carried the Ascari's weapon and did other kinds of domestic chores when soldiers were on campaign. And so Bayoumi Mohammed Hussein grew up in that way, and during World War I, that's the kind of work that he did. After the war, he found ways to make a living still kind of in the service of Germans on ocean liners. He eventually ended up settling in Germany and took on work as language instructor, and he worked in hospitality. And then he also became kind of a fixture within the German entertainment industry. He was part of films that were made in the 1930s that were backed by, or made by Nazi sympathizers. And much like the people that you saw in Dr. Aitken's presentation last week, who were part of these so-called human zoos, this was a space where Black people could actually make a living in Germany with some degree of success, right? So what you see here is that he took on the role of the Ascari in film. So he's not wearing an official uniform here, he's wearing a costume. But here he is as a grown man, kind of playing an Ascari in a film, playing a role that he himself had played as a youth during World War I. Now, the image that you see on the left is one that you may be familiar with. Have any of you seen these before? It's a kind of a memorial. Has anyone seen this before? Or something like it?
Carson? What is
Yeah, they're like, I guess you could say memorial stones that are
Mhm.
generally in front of houses or buildings where individuals that were persecuted by the Nazis used to live, and they're
Mhm.
all over Germany.
Yeah. So there are not many that are placed for Black Germans, but this is one. And so, you know, I already read you his birth date, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, but what's that second part? Verhaftet September 1941. Does
So he's
anyone know?
arrested.
Yep. So he was arrested in 1941, and then it says Sachsenhausen, which was a concentration camp, and then it says Tod on the 24th of November 1944. So somewhere in there, there's a whole other story about him, which takes us from his relative success within this fraught film industry, which is playing on German racist imagination about how Black people fit into this kind of new imperial and colonial vision that is being evoked for a new Germany. And then his death at a concentration camp in the midst of World War II, right? So the bigger story is that he was arrested for having violated miscegenation laws because he married a German woman, white German woman, and he also had a number of other women who he had sexual relationships with. He had a number of children. And so he was arrested. He actually fought back against the charges that were filed against him. And, but ultimately he was incarcerated at Sachsenhausen, and he's believed to have died of typhoid or typhus while he was there. So it's a really sort of terribly sad ending to a story of a man who clearly was somebody who was quite resourceful, somebody who took it upon himself to make a way out of German East Africa at a time when not only would it have been quite difficult to do that as a young African man, but in an age when Germany itself was struggling to recover from World War I and the violence of Weimar, and then this transition into fascism, right? He somehow made it, and this is extraordinary, only to succumb to Nazi violence in this all too familiar way, right? So the original question was about status, and I think it's important to note the ways that German racial politics and the violence that grew out of it, of those politics, separated people in ways that were useful to those politics, right? So it's fine to have African soldiers in German East Africa there because that serves imperial purposes. Having them in Germany itself with a bit of status based on that kind of permitted hierarchy there, where Askari were very esteemed in certain ways and viewed as comrades. Having those people in Germany is a whole different thing. And that is a threat during the Third Reich. So I hope that that makes sense. That was a little bit complicated, but this is an important story to know about. And this Stolperstein, you can see it in Berlin if you're ever there. The address is right there, Brunnenstraße. When I was there, it was covered up by a bunch of bicycles, but I did find it.
Yeah, this class will be in Berlin, hopefully as a pandemic pending in May. So we'll be sure to go look at that. And this brings actually our conversation about sort of the lingering ramifications of German colonialism to the present. So there's some questions here about the present and how German colonialism and the effects and you know, the memory of the Ascari who died for Germany, right, or the memory of colonialism in general is remembered in Germany. So maybe you could speak to that. In addition to the Stolpersteine, what else is there, and what should we be paying attention to?
Yeah. You know, it's better than it was. I'll say that for sure. When I was doing my dissertation research in 2000, so 2004 to 2006, it coincided with the anniversary of two major anti-colonial uprisings that happened in German East Africa and German Southwest Africa. And so there were commemorative activities then that were really kind of a sea change. They, you know, for Germany, which had always been so invested in the Vergangenheitsbewältigung endeavor, it's almost as if thinking about colonialism was just a bridge too far. Like you can't, we've already done all of this other thinking about the ways that we are implicated in imperial fascist violence. We don't need to think about this relatively temporally short-lived moment where German colonialism took hold in these 4 places in Africa and several places in the Pacific, right? We don't, that's not worth considering. So there was around that time a much more concrete and substantive engagement with the German colonial past. There was a significant exhibit that took place at the Deutsches Historisches Museum, you know, television productions, and just kind of much more activity around at least acknowledging that Germany had a colonial past. So, you know, 20 years on from that, I think there's been much more scholarship, there's been much more kind of activism within the Black German community and the kind of wider communities of those who are supporting immigrants and really trying to bring to the fore the fact that Germany has much more work to do to understand its past of fascist violence and imperial violence. So I think, you know, we're in a much better position now, but as you may know, I'm not sure if you've talked about this before, but it's definitely something to consider. There's been a longstanding lawsuit that was brought by survivors, Herero survivors, descendants of Herero genocide survivors, who have been pushing for a long time now for Germany to make reparations to them for the harm that they caused during the 1904 to 1907 genocide. And, you know, that the German government has obfuscated and has sidestepped and has made all sorts of excuses for how it, you know, it's already made reparations through the form of aid and that sort of thing. But what it really boils down to is not taking seriously what the Herero descendants have laid before the German government and the public about what it means to have lost everything because of the war, and then the German purposeful expropriation of anything that the Herero had owned, most importantly land and cattle. And then obviously also the massive loss of human life that shrank the Herero population substantially, right? So, so that's ongoing. That is still something that is under discussion, although, you know, Germany has made gestures. They've begun to return items that were stolen, including human remains. This is all a sordid, horrible history, which I encourage you to understand, because it's not just a German story, it's indicative of the entire European colonial endeavor. But this is ongoing. So if you're in Germany and you have the opportunity to see any exhibitions or to visit places that are grappling with these questions, I think those are the places to look for. And I'm not exactly sure what is going on right at the moment, but there are so many places now that have organizations. Usually they're called something post-colonial, so Hamburg post-colonial or Freiburg post-colonial. These are networks of activists and scholars who have done the research on how different parts of Germany have been were involved in colonial activities on different scales. And those are the places where you're likely to find experts on what's been going on in terms, both in terms of the kind of nation state level politics, but also the local efforts to not only make people grapple with the colonial history, but also to remember the Black people and other, excuse me, other colonized peoples who ended up either in Germany or, sorry, let me take a drink, or who in some way came into contact with the German colonial project.
Yeah, we'll take one of those post-colonial tours when we're in Berlin, and looking forward to that.
Perfect.
Yeah, and
so I'll add one thing too. I mean, one of the things that those organizations have been successful in doing is initiating some renaming projects. So streets have been renamed, for example. The founder of the Schutztruppe in East Africa, Hermann von Wissmann, had a street named after him in kind of the edge of, what is it, Kreuzberg and Neukölln. There was Hermann von Wissmann Straße, which recently was renamed. And there are other examples. My IM now has a street named after her. So those are also really interesting new developments that have come through the labor of these activist and scholarly communities.
who's next with their question? Conrad, why don't you bring up your question here?
Okay, so I've taken another course that engaged really intently with sort of like the pharmacological and natural histories that have been done on the continent, specifically Karen Flint's recent monograph, Healing Traditions. And so that book really led me to thinking about the theft not only of bodies and violence inflicted upon them, but also ecological knowledge, and that as a form of subsistence and maintaining networks of kinship, but also being able to operate and live a life that's somewhat more self-determined than perhaps other experiences under colonial apparatuses may have been. And so I was just wondering what sources or narratives you came across about the management of exploiting natural knowledge from agriculture and plants with known pharmaceutical value in the German colonial context.
Gosh, that's a great question. And I think the only way I can answer it is to, again, point to the ways that, and this is not a positive story about this at all. It's the ways that people like the Ascari were absolutely immersed in the project of destroying that kind of knowledge, right? And destroying people's possibilities for using that knowledge. And replacing it with a plantation economy that was about making profit and not about growing crops that would sustain the local population, right? So that's one piece of it. I think another way to look at it, though, is to think about, and this is something I would have to go back and really look at. So I appreciate your comment and question. What kinds of methods are the members of Ascari households, for example, using to treat wounds and illnesses that Western medicine have failed to manage properly, or they don't have any knowledge about it whatsoever, right? So certainly on military campaigns, there were medics and there were people who were trained to treat wounds and that sort of thing. But I'm 100% sure that much of the care work that happened to treat wounded or sick soldiers or other members of these military columns took place at the level of the household, and that women who had knowledge of local healing practices and that sort of thing were the ones who brought that expertise. So I think, that would be a wonderful thing to look for. And I've done a bit of work now on thinking about the other side, right? The people who fought back against the Ascari. And I know for sure there you would also see indications of how people are using local plant life in medicinal ways. But I can't say that I've done a lot of specific, work on that so far, but I'm very interested in it for sure. So thank you. That gives me something to think about. And if you're interested in this in particular, I don't know if you've come across Laura Foster's work, but she has written about, what's the plant? Hoodia, Hoodia. She's studied the ways that, so that she does work with a Namibian, one of the Namibian peoples who have over a very long time used Hoodia for medicinal purposes. And she kind of charts the way that that has been co-opted by corporate and wider kind of global seekers of traditional healing methods. She's my colleague here at IU, and she's really great. So I would encourage you to look up her work as well if you're interested in this.
I will. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We're hitting the end of our time together, but I think and everyone's being especially quiet today. I think we've hit that mark in the semester already where it's overwhelm time.
Understood.
Yeah, but there is another good question, and I think a good one to end on. So could you speak more about what inspired you to do this particular research, the research into the social and cultural history of African soldiers in the colonial army of German East Africa? And was there anything in your findings that surprised you? So I guess, could you tell us a little bit about your journey as a scholar, and then anything that's really, stuck out for you in your research?
Yeah, so I'll try to do this in a nutshell, because you can also just read the acknowledgments of my book, which I think I lay things out pretty plainly. But my father was my father was African American. He is now deceased, but African American, and he joined the military when he was 18, right out of high school. And then I too went in the Air Force after I finished college. And I was in for 10 years. So between my father and I, there's, kind of 40 years of military service. I grew up as a military brat, as we're called. And, I was always, my father always educated me on kind of what it meant to be a Black person in the United States. That was part of my upbringing. That was part of my alternate education that I wasn't getting in school. But, at the same time, he was part of this organization that I then also joined that is responsible for so much violence, right? And I've spent my entire adult life kind of dealing with that problem. When I got interested in graduate school and African history specifically, I knew that I wanted to do something that would involve the former German colonies, because I had German language skills, because I grew up in Germany, because my dad was in the military. And I didn't start out writing about the Askari. I started out writing about German colonial language policy in Tanzania. And that kind of sparked for me some interesting ways of thinking about colonialism that it was all kind of new to me anyway, but it just made me think in a lot of new ways about history, about how people are imbricated, enmeshed in these structures that provide them with the means to succeed in life, right? Joining the military is a great way to get an education, get healthcare, travel around the world, all of that. At the same time that it is absolutely, that you're absolutely involved in work that has the potential to cause tremendous harm, right? And the problem of being Black in this country in particular, where military service may give you those things, but it will never protect you from white supremacy, right? So you may get upward mobility and achieve certain degrees of success, as my father did, as did I, but you are never insulated from white supremacy. That turns on a dime, right? You meet the wrong people at the wrong time, get stopped by the cops, wrong place, wrong time. That is always a threat. And so how does one then choose to join the military and to serve a state that has no vested interest in protecting you, right? In the same way that it does for fellow citizens who are white. So that was the heart of the question. And what happened was I stumbled upon the East African campaign of World War I. I got very interested in the Askari because of all of the lore around them as being loyal and super effective soldiers. And it went from there. And the basic question I kept asking was, who are these men and why are they doing this? That's what I did in my dissertation. And in the book, then I had much more, after all my research, I had much more ability to kind of frame this argument about their quest for respectability as the driving factor of why they would sign on to this work. Because what Black person volunteers to fight for the Nazis, right? I mean, that's the simplistic way that my brain was processing this conundrum. Overly simplistic, but that's kind of the basis for how I got into this work. And yeah, I'm still really sort of That's the driving question for me that continues to bring me back to these people and these problems.
So in closing, I'd like to say a big thank you to Dr. Moyd, Emily, our students, and importantly to Davidson College for making so many important conversations possible. Today's recording will soon be among the other 24 on our All Black Lives Matter YouTube playlist. If you're not already registered, there's still time to join us this Thursday through Sunday, February 17th to the 20th, 2022, when the 10th anniversary and 5th International BGHRA Conference will be hosted virtually by Africana Studies at Rutgers University, Camden. Our theme is All Black Lives Matter, Black Germany and Beyond, and registration is still open. Visit our website at bghra.org for details. Proceeds from purchases at our conference swag shop will support Black German artists and our graduate student initiatives. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and YouTube channel and to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. A new series of events, Black Germany and Beyond, will begin right after the conference, so stay tuned. There's so much more to come. We hope that you've enjoyed today's conversation with Dr. Michelle Moyd as much as we have. And until Thursday, we thank you again for your time and attention.